The most devastating moment of John Wayne's life did not occur on a battlefield or a movie set, but in a Beverly Hills mansion on a Saturday night in March 1965, when the man who had embodied American masculinity for 3 decades mistook fame for permission to mock another man's dignity. What followed were 3 seconds of absolute silence and a single, understated gesture that carried the full weight of moral judgment, one that shattered Wayne's reputation among the people whose respect he valued most. Dean Martin did not throw a punch, raise his voice, or deliver a lecture on decency. Instead, he rose from his chair, met Wayne's gaze with a look of quiet, unmistakable disgust, and walked out. In Hollywood's delicate social hierarchy, that simple act proved more damaging than any public scandal, more humiliating than a bad review, and more devastating than any box office failure. Because when Dean Martin, the coolest man in America, decided you were not worth sharing the same air, everyone else understood the message immediately. And that message was unmistakable. John Wayne had crossed a line no decent person could excuse. That warm March evening, producer Arthur Freed's Beverly Hills mansion stood at the epicenter of Hollywood power, hosting a guest list that read like a roll call of American entertainment: directors, stars, studio executives, and cultural power brokers whose choices shaped what millions watched and heard. These gatherings were not merely parties, but informal summits where careers were forged, deals quietly sealed, and the invisible boundaries of acceptable behavior firmly enforced. Dean Martin arrived fashionably late, as always, at the height of his success in 1965, having seamlessly evolved from the Martin and Lewis comedy act into a polished solo career spanning music, film, and television. His variety show dominated the ratings, his albums topped the charts, his films made money, and, most importantly, he possessed something rare in Hollywood: universal respect without fear. By the time he entered Freed's opulent living room, where crystal glasses shimmered beneath a grand chandelier and cigarette smoke hung like atmosphere around conversations destined for the trade papers, the room pulsed with the electricity of power and status. At its center stood John Wayne, commanding attention like a living monument to American masculinity. At 57, the Duke remained the most recognizable face in American cinema, a towering figure whose screen persona had fused completely with his public identity. John Wayne did not merely portray heroes. In the public imagination, he was one, the embodiment of frontier courage, moral certainty, and unyielding strength. His presence at any Hollywood gathering carried the weight of cultural authority. Yet power, as Dean Martin understood better than most, had a way of corroding even its icons. Sheltered by decades of adoration and surrounded by people who laughed at his jokes out of deference rather than amusement, Wayne had begun to believe his legendary status granted him freedom to say anything to anyone without consequence. The tension began the moment Sammy Davis Jr. entered the room. His arrival subtly altered the atmosphere. Despite his immense talent and the reluctant respect he commanded within the industry, his presence in certain Hollywood circles still stirred unease. It was 1965. Civil rights legislation had been signed into law, but the hearts and habits of many Americans, including some in Hollywood, lagged far behind the progress on paper. Dean Martin had been Sammy's friend and protector for years, their bond extending far beyond the usual limits of show business alliances into something closer to genuine brotherhood, rooted in mutual respect, shared experience, and Dean's absolute intolerance for any slight against those he considered family. In Dean's personal code, loyalty was not merely a virtue, but the very foundation of character. As Sammy moved through the party, greeting friends and colleagues with his trademark charm and energy, conversations brightened and laughter grew more sincere. Despite the social barriers he still faced, he possessed a magnetic presence born of extraordinary talent and an infectious personality that illuminated every room he entered.
John Wayne followed Sammy's progress with the focused attention of a predator sizing up its target. He had been drinking, not enough to lose control, but enough to loosen restraint and embolden long-held prejudices. While performing for an audience of industry power brokers, he assumed shared his views on race and hierarchy. In Wayne's mind, he was preparing to deliver the kind of blunt truth his screen persona celebrated. The moment came when Sammy joined a group that included Wayne, Dean, and several other prominent figures, launching into a story about a recent performance. His hands moved expressively as he described the audience's reaction to a particularly demanding song, and the small circle around him responded with genuine laughter and engagement, drawn in by Sammy's effortless storytelling. Then John Wayne chose the moment to reassert what he believed was the natural order of things. Speaking with the easy authority of a man used to commanding rooms, he remarked that Sammy was surprisingly articulate, framing the comment as a backhanded judgment rather than a compliment. The effect was immediate and jarring. Laughter vanished. Nearby conversations faltered, and a heavy silence settled as everyone grasped what had just occurred. The symbol of American heroism had reduced one of the most gifted entertainers of his generation to a crude stereotype. Interpreting the stunned quiet as approval, Wayne pressed on, adding another remark that was sharper and more openly cruel, suggesting that Sammy's talent and poise were merely borrowed traits picked up through proximity rather than earned in his own right. The second comment cut deeper than the first, deliberately humiliating and designed to reinforce Wayne's sense of superiority in front of an audience he assumed would tolerate it. Wayne was performing his prejudice, wielding his fame as a weapon against someone who could not respond without risking his career. Sammy Davis Jr. stood motionless, his expression carefully composed, struggling to conceal the damage the words had done. Everyone in the circle understood that Sammy could not respond with the anger the remark deserved. In the rigid social calculus of Hollywood in 1965, any sharp retort would be twisted into confirmation of the very stereotypes used against him, while any visible hurt would be read as weakness. He was trapped in a moment of public humiliation, with no safe way to defend himself. The other men shifted uneasily, fixing their attention on their glasses, the floor, or anywhere that spared them from taking a stand. Many privately recoiled from Wayne's words, but confronting John Wayne demanded a level of moral courage few were willing to risk when careers and influence hung in the balance. Dean Martin, however, was not like most people. He had watched the exchange with the focused stillness he usually reserved for high-stakes poker, his expression calm but tightly controlled. Those who knew him well recognized the signs, the faint tightening around his eyes, the deliberate placement of his drink, the subtle adjustment of his posture that signaled resolve. For a long, suspended moment, Dean said nothing at all. He simply looked at John Wayne with a quiet, unmistakable contempt that spoke more powerfully than any words could have.
It was a look that conveyed a single, unmistakable message. I see exactly who you are, and I am repelled by it. Then Dean Martin stood. There was no drama in the movement, no raised voice, no theatrical display of anger. He rose with the effortless grace that marked everything he did, smoothed his perfectly tailored jacket, and allowed his eyes to travel briefly around the group one last time. They settled on John Wayne for a few measured seconds, long enough for Wayne to feel the full weight of judgment, yet not long enough to invite confrontation. Dean said nothing. He simply turned and walked away. From across the room, the gesture might have seemed inconsequential, but everyone standing near Wayne understood its meaning instantly. Dean Martin, the undisputed arbiter of cool, a man whose approval carried more weight than awards or headlines, had rendered a verdict on John Wayne's character and found it unworthy of his presence. In Hollywood's intricate social calculus, that quiet exit was a weapon of extraordinary force. By refusing to engage, argue, or excuse, Dean delivered a judgment far more devastating than words could have achieved, making it clear that Wayne's behavior placed him beneath contempt and unworthy of even the effort required to confront him. The immediate aftermath of Dean's departure crackled with tension. The cluster that had formed around Wayne began to dissolve, its members suddenly discovering pressing reasons to be elsewhere, eager to distance themselves from what had just unfolded. No one wanted to be linked to the moment. Sammy Davis Jr., understanding that his remaining would only deepen the discomfort, quietly excused himself and left the party altogether. John Wayne was left standing alone in the center of Arthur Freed's living room, slowly grasping that his words had triggered a social catastrophe unlike anything he had faced before. Across the room, guests stole glances in his direction, their expressions a mix of disapproval, unease, and thinly veiled disgust. The man who had built a career portraying figures of unwavering moral certainty had exposed himself as profoundly lacking it, and he had done so in front of the very audience that mattered most. Yet the true damage was only beginning. Within 24 hours, the story of what had happened at Arthur Freed's party began circulating through Hollywood's invisible networks, retold in whispers and private conversations. The details shifted with each telling, but the core of the incident never changed. The story that spread was simple and damning. John Wayne had made racist remarks about Sammy Davis Jr., and Dean Martin had answered by walking out in open disgust. In an industry where image was currency, Wayne's standing began to erode with startling speed. Directors once eager to collaborate suddenly became unreachable. Studio executives who had returned calls within hours now let days pass, and social invitations quietly disappeared. The informal web of influence that had sustained his career for decades began to close ranks, treating him less like a legend and more like a liability. The true damage did not lie solely in the incident itself, but in what it exposed. As whispers multiplied, stories surfaced of similar remarks Wayne had made in the past, moments long dismissed as harmless or excused as personality quirks. What had once been shrugged off as John being John now took on a harsher meaning, revealing character flaws increasingly at odds with the heroic image he represented. Dean Martin, for his part, never addressed the incident publicly. He didn't have to. His silence, paired with his decisive action, spoke clearly about his values and his loyalty to Sammy Davis Jr. By refusing to engage in public condemnation or self-righteous commentary, Dean's response carried even greater weight. It was understood not as a performance, but as a principled stand, and Hollywood recognized the difference immediately. The contrast between Dean Martin's response and John Wayne's behavior became a quiet case study in the difference between performed and authentic masculinity. Wayne had attempted to assert dominance through intimidation and prejudice. Dean demonstrated real strength through moral clarity and unwavering loyalty. One exposed insecurity masquerading as power, while the other revealed confidence so secure it required no display. Sammy Davis Jr. was deeply affected by Dean's gesture. Though they never spoke of the incident directly, their interactions afterward carried an added warmth and unspoken gratitude, a recognition that Dean had risked his own standing to defend Sammy's dignity. What was already a strong bond became unbreakable. The consequences of that March evening reached far beyond personal relationships. John Wayne's sudden fall of grace became a warning to others in Hollywood who harbored similar views. Racism would no longer be indulged in polite society, even when voiced by the most powerful figures. More broadly, the incident signaled a turning point in Hollywood's evolving relationship with civil rights, marking a shift in what the industry was willing to excuse and what it would no longer tolerate. The entertainment industry, which had often lagged behind social progress out of fear of alienating conservative audiences, began to recognize that moral courage was not only ethically right, but smart business. Audiences were evolving, and figures unwilling to evolve with them risked being left behind. Dean Martin's gesture set a powerful example for how decent people could confront bigotry. Instead of engaging in arguments or trying to educate the willingly ignorant, sometimes the strongest response is simply to refuse participation in ugliness. By walking away, Dean preserved his integrity while making his values unmistakably clear. The story became legendary in Hollywood, passed down as a lesson in standing up for what is right, even when it is inconvenient. Young performers entering the industry heard of that night, and Dean Martin's single gesture at Arthur Freed's party became a masterclass in how true stars behave when tested by moral challenges. Years later, John Wayne attempted to repair his reputation through charitable work and carefully curated public statements, but the damage from that March evening lingered. He never fully regained the universal respect he had once commanded, and his later films often seemed shadowed by the contrast between his heroic screen persona and the flawed man revealed in real life. Dean Martin, for his part, emerged with his reputation strengthened. His willingness to sacrifice social comfort for principle cemented his status not just as an entertainer, but as a man of genuine substance.
The cool exterior that had made Dean Martin famous now revealed something deeper, genuine inner strength rather than mere charm or surface sophistication. The Beverly Hills mansion where the incident occurred has changed owners many times since 1965, but the room where Dean took his stand remains largely as it was. If you know where to look, you can still spot the chair where he sat when John Wayne exposed his true character and trace the path he took to the door, choosing principle over politeness. The impact of that evening, however, extended far beyond the walls of Arthur Freed's living room. Within a week, Frank Sinatra had heard the full story from Dean himself, and his response was swift and decisive. John Wayne was quietly removed from the guest list for all future Rat Pack gatherings. There was no announcement, no explanation. Wayne simply ceased to exist within their social sphere. The exclusion was devastating. The Rat Pack symbolized the pinnacle of cool sophistication in American culture, and being shut out by them amounted to social death among Hollywood's elite. As a result, Wayne became increasingly isolated, invited to fewer industry events, and cut off from the informal networks that had sustained his career for decades. Meanwhile, other influential figures in Hollywood began to reassess their relationships with John Wayne. Director John Ford, who had helped make him a star, reportedly expressed private disappointment in his protégé's behavior. Studio executives who had once competed to secure Wayne's services quietly debated whether continuing to associate with him might tarnish their own reputations. Yet the most painful consequences were personal rather than professional. Wayne's children, who had long admired their father's heroic screen persona, began to question whether the man they knew at home matched the legend on screen. Family dinners grew tense, his political views increasingly challenged rather than accepted without question. The generational divide sweeping through America in the 1960s had entered the Wayne household, with his own children reflecting shifting social values. Sammy Davis Jr., for his part, chose not to respond publicly to Wayne's remarks, but those close to him understood the impact. Despite his success and talent, Sammy had always carried the weight of being one of the few black performers navigating predominantly white entertainment circles. Wayne's casual cruelty reopened old wounds, a stark reminder that his acceptance in Hollywood society remained conditional. The strength and reassurance Sammy drew from Dean Martin's gesture, however, cannot be overstated. In a world where few were willing to risk their own comfort to defend his dignity, Dean Martin's walkout provided Sammy Davis Jr. with profound emotional support. It confirmed that he had at least one ally who valued his humanity above social convenience. Dean's decisive action also prompted other performers to reflect on their own principles. Those who had previously stayed silent in the face of prejudice began speaking out more often. The incident became a catalyst for broader conversations about racism in Hollywood, compelling the industry to confront its complicity in sustaining discriminatory practices. Media coverage of the incident was minimal, typical of Hollywood scandals in the 1960s. The entertainment press, largely controlled by studio publicity departments, had little interest in exposing the moral failings of major stars. Yet the story spread quietly among industry insiders and gradually seeped into public awareness through gossip columns and magazine features. Its power lay in its simplicity. There were no hidden motives, no political maneuvering, no gray areas to debate. John Wayne had revealed himself as a racist, and Dean Martin had responded with silent, uncompromising moral judgment. The clarity of the moral contrast made neutrality impossible. The incident also underscored the stark difference in their approaches to masculinity. Wayne's persona relied on domination, intimidation, and hierarchical assertion, while Dean's strength came from confidence, loyalty, and the quiet authority born of moral certainty. The contrast between the two men could not have been clearer, and audiences began to take notice. In the years that followed, as America wrestled with civil rights and generational change, Dean Martin's walkout became a cultural touchstone, a symbol of the moment when entrenched prejudices were confronted by evolving values, when performative heroism was exposed by genuine courage. The 3 seconds of silence before Dean rose captured a moral clarity that echoed the broader social awakening transforming the nation. John Wayne's later efforts to rehabilitate his image were constantly undermined by the memory of that night. Every attempt to cast himself as a defender of American values was shadowed by the moment he demeaned Sammy Davis Jr. The incident became an enduring stain on his legacy, a reminder that private character often outweighs public persona. For Dean Martin, the walkout stood as one of the defining acts of his career, quiet, principled, and powerful, even though he never sought publicity for it. The gesture cemented Dean Martin's reputation as a man of integrity, someone who could not be bought, intimidated, or swayed by Hollywood's power structures. His legendary coolness was more than style, it reflected unshakable inner principles. That night, when Dean Martin humiliated John Wayne with a single, quiet gesture, it became a defining moment for both men and for Hollywood itself. It proved that authentic heroism cannot be performed, it can only be lived, one moral choice at a time. Sometimes the most powerful response to hatred is not argument or anger, but the simple refusal to share space with those who practice it. The 3 seconds of silence before Dean rose echoed for decades, shaping John Wayne's reputation and underscoring that, in the court of public opinion, character outweighs charisma, and dignity surpasses fame. Dean Martin left that party carrying more than his coat. He carried the knowledge that he had acted rightly at the crucial moment, and for a person of principle, that was victory enough.